I never thought betrayal would come dressed in the guise of simplicity. Looking back, the signs were all there, faint and subtle as whispers through a dense forest. My wife, Elaine, had always been a creature of habit. She'd wake early, tend to our garden, and hum softly as she prepared breakfast. We lived in a small village on the edge of a sprawling forest, where life was simple, predictable, and safe, or so I thought. It all began one fateful morning when Elaine told me she needed firewood for the coming winter. Her suggestion was practical enough. We'd run low on kindling, and hiring someone to fetch it made sense. "There's a woodcutter in the next town," she said, her voice light. "Everyone says he's reliable." Her words didn't feel strange at the time, but later, I would wonder about the excitement that seemed to flicker behind her eyes. The woodcutter arrived the following day, a tall, rugged man with arms like tree trunks and a smile too wide for comfort. He introduced himself as Caleb, his voice deep and warm like the crackle of firewood he delivered. Elaine greeted him warmly, offering him a drink and chatting far more than necessary. I stood in the doorway, watching their interaction. It was innocent enough, too innocent, perhaps. Still, I shrugged it off as my overactive imagination. Days passed, and Caleb began to appear more often. He'd bring extra wood, claiming he had a surplus, or stop by to check on the quality of his last delivery. Elaine always seemed to have time for him. They laughed together in ways that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. But doubt is a persistent thing, creeping into the corners of your mind and nesting there. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Elaine with a small trinket I'd bought at the market. As I approached the house, I noticed the curtains were drawn. Odd, for such a sunny day. My heart began to race. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside, and heard faint voices coming from the back room. Her laughter cut through the silence like a blade. I can't explain what I felt in that moment, an unsettling mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the doorway. What I saw made my blood run cold. Elaine sitting too close to Caleb, their hands brushing as they laughed at some private joke. The way she looked at him was unmistakable, an intimacy that was never meant for anyone but me. I didn't confront them then. Instead, I retreated quietly, my gift slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. That sound, the breaking of glass, seemed to echo the shattering of something deeper inside me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the broken pieces, wondering if they were a reflection of my marriage. Elaine found me later, her face flushed and her excuses ready. "Caleb was just leaving," she said, her tone airy. "He offered to repair the gate out back. Isn't that kind of him?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I didn't ask questions. Not then. But from that moment on, I started paying closer attention. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. After that day, the air in our home felt heavier, laden with unspoken tension. Elaine moved through her routines as if nothing had changed, but I began to notice the cracks, subtle, yet undeniable. Her smile lingered too long when Caleb was mentioned. Her laughter had a new cadence, sharper and freer when he was around. I told myself I was imagining things, clinging desperately to the version of her I had always known. I started to watch, not openly, but in quiet moments when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She would step out into the garden, her hands brushing over the herbs she had grown, her gaze fixed on the forest where Caleb lived. There was a longing there, a pull I couldn't compete with. I began to dread the mornings when she'd hum while dressing, knowing it meant she expected him to stop by. One evening, over dinner, I tested the waters. "I saw Caleb in town today," I said, my voice deliberately casual. Elaine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She recovered quickly, but not before I noticed the flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or excitement. "Oh," she said, setting her fork down. "What was he doing?" "Buying supplies," I replied, my gaze steady on her. "He said he'd be stopping by tomorrow. Something about finishing the fence." She nodded, a little too quickly. "He's been so helpful, hasn't he? I don't know what we'd do without him." The words stung, though they were harmless on the surface. I forced a smile, but the food on my plate tasted like ash. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of suspicion pressing down on me like a stone. The next day, I stayed home under the pretense of an illness. I wanted to see them together, to understand if my fears were real or if I was spiraling into paranoia. When Caleb arrived, his axe slung over his shoulder and a grin that could charm the devil himself, I watched from the window as Elaine greeted him. Her hand lingered on his arm, and my chest tightened. They worked on the fence together, talking and laughing as if they were in their own world. At one point, she touched his hand, and he didn't pull away. I felt my fists clench at my sides. It was innocent enough to an outsider, but to me, it was a betrayal, a fracture in the foundation of our marriage. That night, after Caleb had gone, I confronted her. My heart raced as I chose my words carefully. "You've been spending a lot of time with Caleb," I said, my tone even but laced with tension. Elaine looked up from her sewing, her expression calm but guarded. "He's been helping us, that's all." "Why? Are you jealous?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her how I felt like a stranger in my own home, how her every interaction with him felt like a dagger to my chest, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I shook my head. "No, I think it's strange, that's all." "You're being ridiculous," she said, her tone dismissive. "He's just a kind man doing us a favor. Don't make something out of nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it in my bones, a dark certainty that grew stronger with each passing day. I resolved to find the truth. If she wouldn't tell me, I'd uncover it myself, whatever it took. The next morning, I followed Elaine. She left the house with a basket, claiming she was heading to the market. But instead of taking the well-trodden path into town, she turned toward the forest. My heart pounded as I trailed her, keeping a safe distance and ducking behind trees whenever she glanced over her shoulder. The forest had always been a place of solace for us, a sanctuary where we'd shared countless walks and quiet moments. But that day, it felt sinister, the shadows between the trees conspiring to hide the truth I was so desperate to uncover. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath Elaine's feet. She stopped near a clearing where the woodcutter's cabin stood. Caleb emerged moments later, his broad frame silhouetted against the morning light. Elaine smiled at him, and they exchanged a few words I couldn't hear. Then, to my horror, she stepped forward and embraced him. I gripped the rough bark of a tree, my nails digging into it as I fought the urge to storm into the clearing and demand answers. But something stopped me, curiosity, perhaps, or fear. I needed to know the extent of her betrayal. The two of them sat on a fallen log, their heads close together as they talked. Caleb reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she laughed, a soft, melodic sound that once had been meant for me. The sight was unbearable. I turned away, retreating into the shadows of the forest, my mind racing with possibilities. When Elaine returned home later that day, I was waiting for her. She seemed startled to find me sitting at the kitchen table, my arms crossed and my expression grim. "How was the market?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She hesitated, just for a moment, before setting the basket down on the counter. "Busy," she said, her voice steady. "I found some lovely herbs for supper." I stared at her, searching for any sign of remorse or deceit. But her face was a mask, calm and unreadable. "Did you see anyone interesting?" I pressed. She looked at me then, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you getting at?" "I saw you, Elaine," I said, my voice low. "In the woods. With him." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she let out a shaky laugh. "You were spying on me? Do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds?" "Don't turn this on me," I snapped, standing up. "You lied to me. You said you were going to the market, but you went to see him." Her expression hardened. "And what if I did? Caleb is my friend. He listens to me in ways you never do." The words hit me like a slap. "Is that all he is?" I asked, my voice breaking. "A friend?" Elaine looked away, her silence louder than any confession. My chest tightened. the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. "I don't want to talk about this right now," she said finally, brushing past me. "I'm going to bed." I stood there, stunned and helpless, as she disappeared into the bedroom. The house felt colder without her presence, as if the warmth we'd shared had been snuffed out like a dying flame. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in the forest, her laughter, the way she leaned into Caleb as if he were her anchor. Rage bubbled beneath my skin, but it was tempered by a deep, gnawing sorrow. How had we come to this? What had I done, or failed to do, that made her seek comfort in another man? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. I couldn't let this continue. Something had to change. The next few days were suffocating. Elaine moved through the house as if nothing had happened, humming softly while she cooked or tended to her garden. But I could feel the distance between us growing, a chasm that widened with every passing moment. Her laughter was brittle, her smiles fleeting, and yet she made no effort to explain herself, no attempt to bridge the gap. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Caleb, the way she had leaned into him, the softness in her voice when she spoke to him. It was a part of her I hadn't seen in years. I told myself I would confront him, demand answers. But each time I thought of his towering frame and the easy confidence in his smile, my courage faltered. Instead, I turned my frustration inward. I began questioning everything about our marriage, replaying moments from the past like a broken record. Had she been unhappy for years? Had I missed the signs? Or was this something new? A temptation too strong for her to resist? I wasn't sure, but the uncertainty ate at me like a disease. One evening, while Elaine was out gathering wildflowers, I finally decided to search for answers. Her garden shed had always been her sanctuary, a place she retreated to when she needed space. I had never intruded before, but desperation overruled my hesitation. Pushing open the door, I stepped inside. The air smelled of soil and lavender, a scent that once brought me comfort but now felt cloying. The shed was meticulously organized, every tool in its place, every pot labeled. But it was the small writing desk in the corner that drew my attention. On the desk lay a journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with use. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding, before flipping it open. The pages were filled with Elaine's neat handwriting, detailing her thoughts and musings over the years. At first, the entries were innocuous, notes about the weather, gardening tips, and recipes. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Today I met Caleb. He's kind and hardworking, with a laugh that feels like sunshine breaking through clouds. He reminds me of a version of myself I thought I'd lost. I feel guilty, but I can't help it. Being with Caleb is like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a room for too long. He sees me in a way no one else does, not even my husband. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I couldn't read anymore. The confirmation of what I had suspected, what I had feared, hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just spending time with Caleb. She was falling for him. I slammed the journal shut and left the shed, my hands trembling. The night air was cool, but I felt like I was burning from the inside out. Elaine returned shortly after, her arms full of wildflowers. She smiled when she saw me, as if we were still the same couple we had always been. But I couldn't return her smile. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice light. "Thinking," I said curtly, brushing past her. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was a storm of anger and sorrow, swirling with images of Elaine and Caleb, their laughter, their shared moments. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to act. The next morning, while Elaine was busy in the garden, I slipped away and headed for the forest. I didn't know what I would say to Caleb, but I knew I had to face him. My steps were heavy with determination, each one fueled by the betrayal that simmered in my chest. When I reached his cabin, he was outside, splitting logs with a steady rhythm. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked, setting down his axe. I swallowed hard, my fists clenching at my sides. "We need to talk." He nodded, motioning for me to sit on a nearby stump, but I didn't sit. Instead, I stared him down, searching his face for any hint of guilt. What's going on between you and my wife? I demanded, my voice shaking. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. She's unhappy, he said simply. The words cut deeper than I expected. So that gives you the right to? To what? He interrupted, his voice calm but firm. To talk to her? To listen when she needs someone to understand her? I haven't done anything you couldn't do yourself. The accusation stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in his words. Still, the idea of another man stepping into the space I should have filled made my blood boil. She's my wife, I said through gritted teeth. And she loves you, Caleb said, his gaze steady. But love isn't enough if you don't see her for who she really is. She feels invisible, like a ghost in her own home. I wanted to punch him, to knock the smug certainty out of his expression. But instead, I turned and walked away, his words ringing in my ears. As I made my way back home, one thought consumed me. Was it too late to save my marriage? Or had Elaine already slipped too far from my grasp? Caleb's words haunted me. The idea that Elaine felt invisible, that I had failed to see her as she truly was. It gnawed at me, blending guilt with my simmering rage. Yet, I couldn't forgive him either. The bond they had formed was a betrayal, even if it hadn't yet crossed certain lines. Or perhaps it had, and Caleb had chosen his words carefully to mask the truth. I returned home that afternoon, hoping Elaine wouldn't notice the storm raging inside me. But she did. She always did. You've been quiet lately, she said as we sat across from each other at the dinner table. I stabbed at my food, not meeting her gaze. Just tired. Is that all? Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a challenge. I looked up, forcing myself to meet her eyes. What do you want me to say, Elaine? That everything feels fine? That I don't notice how different you've been? How distant we are? Her fork froze midair, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But instead, she sighed and set it down. I don't know what you want from me, Henry. I've been trying to find something that makes me feel alive again. Alive? I snapped, the word catching like a thorn in my throat. And Caleb makes you feel alive? Her face paled, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. You don't understand, she whispered. Then help me understand, I said, my voice rising. Help me understand why the woman I married is looking for life in another man's company instead of her own husband's. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. Because you don't see me anymore, Henry. You see what you want to see, a version of me that doesn't exist. Caleb, he listens. He doesn't expect me to be anyone other than who I am. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. Had I really been so blind? I wanted to shout, to argue, to refute everything she'd said. But the truth lodged itself in my chest, heavy and undeniable. I don't know how we got here, I said quietly, but I can't keep living like this. Not if you've already decided we're over. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with sadness. I don't want to hurt you, Henry. I never did. Then choose, I said, my voice trembling. Him or me? The silence that followed was unbearable. She didn't answer, and in her hesitation, I saw everything I needed to know. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't go far, just to a small inn on the edge of town. But the act of leaving felt like cutting a tether, letting go of something I had spent years holding on to. I sat in the dark room, staring at the walls, wondering if this was the end. The days that followed were a blur. I avoided home, working long hours and keeping to myself. Elaine didn't call, and I didn't reach out. My anger festered, mingling with a deep sense of loss. I imagined her with Caleb, laughing and sharing the kind of intimacy we once had, and the thought made my blood boil. Then, one evening, I saw them together. I had stopped by the market for supplies, hoping to avoid running into anyone I knew. But as I rounded a corner, there they were, Elaine and Caleb, standing too close, their conversation animated and easy. She looked at him the way she used to look at me, her face lit with a smile that felt like a betrayal in itself. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers in front of everyone. But instead, I turned and walked away, my chest tight with rage. It wasn't until I reached the inn that I realized what had to be done. This wasn't just about Elaine anymore. This was about the man who had stolen her from me, who had wormed his way into our lives and fractured everything we had built. Caleb needed to know what it felt like to lose everything, and I was going to make sure he did. The fury inside me burned brighter with every passing hour, igniting thoughts I had never dared to entertain before. Caleb wasn't just a rival. He was a thief. He had stolen Elaine's attention, her affection, and the life we had built together. He had to pay, and I would be the one to make him. But revenge, I knew, required patience. I couldn't act in haste and risk losing the element of surprise. So, I began to plan. Caleb's routine was easy to track. He spent most of his days in the forest, cutting and hauling wood, and his evenings at his cabin. Sometimes he'd venture into town for supplies or linger at the tavern. The townsfolk adored him. His charm and rugged demeanor made him a favorite among the women, and the men respected his strength and work ethic. But I saw through his facade. Caleb wasn't a noble woodcutter. He was a predator, preying on vulnerable women like Elaine. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my rented room, I sketched out the beginnings of my plan. I couldn't just confront him. It wouldn't be enough. He needed to experience the kind of loss that left scars, the kind that tore a person apart from the inside out. I started with small steps. First, I spread whispers in the village. I spoke to merchants, mentioning Caleb's name in connection with dubious dealings. "Did you hear about the wood he sold to the miller? Warped and useless," I said with an air of casual concern. I wouldn't trust him with my coin. The rumors spread quickly, as they always did in a small town. People began to question Caleb's character, and while he was still welcome in the tavern, I noticed fewer people greeting him with the same warmth. It was a small victory, but it was satisfying nonetheless. Next, I turned my attention to his cabin. Under the cover of darkness, I crept through the forest, my heart pounding with adrenaline. I reached his property, carefully avoiding the creaking boards of his porch, and slipped inside through an unlocked window. The interior was sparse but tidy. A single bed pushed against the wall, a table littered with tools and scraps of paper, and a fireplace that still held the faint scent of smoke. I searched for anything I could use against him, a secret, a weakness, but found nothing. Instead, I decided to create my own chaos. I overturned the table, scattering its contents across the floor. I smashed a chair, breaking it into jagged pieces. Then I took one of his tools, a small hatchet, and buried it in the wooden frame of his door. The message was clear. He wasn't as untouchable as he thought. I slipped back into the night, adrenaline coursing through me. The next morning, as I walked through town, I overheard villagers talking about the break-in at Caleb's cabin. "Who would do such a thing?" one woman whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "Probably someone jealous of his success," another replied. I smiled to myself, satisfied that my efforts were beginning to take root. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Caleb's confidence still radiated, unshaken by the whispers or the vandalism. He was still in my wife's life, still a shadow looming over what little remained of our marriage. The final blow had to be personal. I began to watch Elaine more closely, noting when she left the house and where she went. One afternoon, I saw her enter the forest with a basket of food. I followed at a distance, my breath shallow and my heart pounding. She stopped at Caleb's cabin, her knock soft but insistent. He opened the door, his smile broad, and ushered her inside. I waited in the shadows, the minutes stretching into an eternity. When Elaine finally emerged, her face was flushed, and she clutched the empty basket tightly to her chest. Caleb watched her leave, leaning casually against the doorframe. I clenched my fists, my resolve hardening. Caleb had taken too much from me already. It was time to take something from him, something he would never forget. And I knew exactly how to do it. The days that followed were consumed by my preparations. Caleb had become the focus of every waking thought, a towering figure in my mind, eclipsing everything else. My plan was no longer just about him. It was about Elaine too. If she couldn't see the destruction she had invited into our lives, I would make her see it. The opportunity came late one evening, under a moonless sky. I had overheard Elaine telling a neighbor that Caleb was leaving town to deliver a load of wood to a distant village. It was a perfect chance. His absence would create a void I could exploit. I returned to his cabin that night, armed with tools from my shed. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I moved like a shadow, my steps careful and deliberate. The cabin was dark when I arrived. I stood for a moment, staring at the structure, imagining him inside, laughing at my pain. But the thought of Elaine, the way she had smiled at him, the way she seemed lighter in his presence, fueled my resolve. I worked quickly. Using a crowbar, I pried open the door and slipped inside. The familiar scent of wood and smoke greeted me, but this time, it was tinged with the acrid bite of my rage. I overturned furniture, broke plates, and slashed the mattress with a knife I'd brought. It wasn't enough to destroy his things. I wanted to leave a message. I scrawled words onto the walls with coal from his fireplace. Stay away from her. Before I left, I scattered a handful of Elaine's belongings around the cabin. A scarf she often wore, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. If Caleb saw them, he'd know this wasn't just about him. It was about what he had taken. By the time I returned home, the sun was beginning to rise. I washed the soot from my hands and slipped into bed, feigning sleep when Elaine stirred beside me. The next day, the news spread through the village like wildfire. Caleb's cabin had been ransacked, his belongings destroyed. I feigned surprise when the butcher mentioned it while wrapping up my order. "What a shame," I said, shaking my head. "I hope they catch whoever's responsible." But Caleb wasn't so easily shaken. Later that afternoon, I saw him in the village square, speaking with the constable. His expression was grim but determined. I stayed out of sight, watching as he described the damage. His gestures were animated, and I noticed him holding one of the items I had planted, Elaine's scarf. My heart pounded as the constable nodded and took notes. Caleb seemed convinced he knew who was responsible. I returned home, my mind racing. If Caleb suspected me, he would come for me. But if he thought Elaine was involved, if he believed she had betrayed him too, perhaps the bond they had formed would begin to crack. That evening, as Elaine prepared dinner, I decided to test the waters. "Did you hear about Caleb's cabin?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Her hands stilled, and she looked up, her eyes wary. "What happened?" "Someone broke in," I said, watching her closely. "Destroyed everything." Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might deny her involvement with him. But then she said, "That's terrible. Do they know who did it?" "Not yet," I replied, my gaze steady. "But the constable seems confident they'll find the culprit." Elaine nodded, but her hands trembled as she returned to chopping vegetables. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside me, I heard her whisper Caleb's name in her sleep. It was soft, barely audible, but it was enough to reignite the fire inside me. This wasn't over. Not yet. I had set the pieces in motion, but the game was far from finished. Caleb and Elaine thought they could keep their secrets, that they could build something on the ashes of what we had. But I was going to burn it all to the ground. The days crawled by, each one weighed down by the tension simmering beneath the surface. Elaine kept to herself more than usual, her gaze often distant. She barely spoke during meals, her laughter now a faint echo of what it had once been. I wanted to ask if she had seen Caleb, if they had spoken about the vandalism at his cabin. But I held back, biding my time. One morning, I saw my chance. Elaine left the house early, claiming she needed to visit the seamstress in the next village. As soon as she was out of sight, I followed her, keeping to the shadows of the forest path. She wasn't heading to the seamstress. I had known she wouldn't. Instead, she made her way to Caleb's cabin. From a safe distance, I watched as she approached. He stood in the doorway, his expression dark, holding the scarf I had planted as evidence. Their voices were too low for me to make out the words, but their body language said enough. Elaine was pleading, her hands clasped in front of her, while Caleb's jaw tightened with barely restrained anger. At one point, he threw the scarf to the ground, his voice rising enough for me to catch a single word, "Why?" Elaine reached for his arm, but he stepped back, his head shaking. I felt a grim satisfaction watching the cracks form between them, But it was short-lived. Caleb's posture softened, and he placed a hand on Elaine's shoulder, pulling her into a tight embrace. Rage boiled within me, hot and relentless. They were still clinging to each other, still defying me. I waited until Elaine returned home, her face pale and drawn, before making my next move. That night, under the cover of darkness, I set out again. This time, I wasn't content with subtlety. Caleb's cabin would become a symbol of the destruction he had brought into my life, and I would destroy it in return. I carried a lantern and a can of oil, my steps silent as I approached the cabin. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. Standing outside the cabin, I hesitated for only a moment. Then, with deliberate precision, I poured the oil around the perimeter, letting it soak into the wooden beams. My hands trembled as I struck the flint and lit the lantern, but the trembling stopped as the first flames caught. The fire spread quickly, consuming the dry wood with a roar that echoed through the forest. I stepped back, watching as the cabin was engulfed in flames, the heat pressing against my skin. For a moment, I felt a sick sense of triumph. But then I heard the sound of footsteps. I turned, my heart lurching, to see Caleb emerging from the woods. He stopped short, his face a mask of horror as he took in the sight of his burning home. "What have you done?" he shouted, his voice raw with disbelief. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I ran, the firelight flickering behind me as I disappeared into the shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my own home, my chest heaving as I leaned against the door. My hands were blackened with soot, my clothes reeking of smoke. I stripped them off and hid them beneath the floorboards, my mind racing with what I had just done. The next day, the village buzzed with news of the fire. Caleb had barely escaped with his life, they said. His cabin was reduced to ash, his belongings gone. Elaine's reaction was what I had anticipated. She was distraught, her face pale as she listened to the villagers recount the details. I could see the guilt etched into her features, but she said nothing to me. She didn't have to. The fire had drawn a line in the sand, forcing Caleb and Elaine to face the reality of their choices. But it wasn't enough. I could see it in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at me, the way she flinched when I touched her shoulder. She still loved him. And that meant my work wasn't finished. Elaine's silence was deafening. She moved through our home like a ghost, her shoulders hunched, her expression a mask of sorrow. I pretended not to notice, but her torment fueled something dark inside me, a mix of satisfaction and dread. Caleb had survived the fire, and while his home was gone, the bond they shared wasn't severed. I had underestimated the resilience of their connection. A week after the fire, Elaine announced she needed to go into town. She claimed it was for supplies, but I saw through the lie. She had been distant, distracted, and I knew her thoughts were with him. My suspicion was confirmed when I caught a glimpse of her slipping a folded piece of paper into her pocket. A note, no doubt meant for Caleb. This time, I wouldn't let her actions go unchecked. After she left, I followed at a distance, careful to remain unseen. She didn't head toward the market, but instead took a narrow path leading to a secluded clearing near the river. Caleb was already there, his rugged form hunched as he knelt by the water, washing soot-stained hands. Elaine approached him cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. Caleb looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. They spoke in hushed tones, the tension between them palpable. I crept closer, my heart pounding, until I was close enough to hear their voices. "I'm sorry, Caleb," Elaine said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted any of this to happen." "You think that matters now?" Caleb replied bitterly. "My home is gone. Everything I worked for, destroyed." Tears welled in Elaine's eyes. "I'll help you rebuild. I'll do whatever it takes." Caleb shook his head. "It's not just about the cabin, Elaine. It's tearing your life apart." Her silence spoke volumes. "You need to decide," Caleb continued, his tone firm. "If we keep this up, it'll destroy both of us. I can't keep living like this, hiding in the shadows." Elaine reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "I can't lose you, Caleb." The words felt like a knife to my chest. My fists clenched at my sides as I watched them, the temptation to storm into the clearing nearly overwhelming. But I held back, letting their conversation play out. "If you're serious about this," Caleb said, his voice softening, "then you have to leave him. You can't have it both ways." Elaine nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I need time," she whispered. Caleb hesitated before pulling her into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if shielding her from the world. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. By the time I returned home, Elaine was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a faraway look in her eyes. She didn't acknowledge me as I entered, and I didn't press her. That night, as she lay beside me in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Elaine was slipping further away, her heart tethered to Caleb even as she stayed under my roof. I couldn't let her leave, not like this, not for him. If Caleb wanted to rebuild, I would make sure he had nothing left to rebuild for. And if Elaine thought she could keep hiding in the shadows, she was wrong. I was done watching from the sidelines. The time had come to take control. The next morning, I set my final plan into motion. Elaine thought she could keep living in limbo, balancing her affection for Caleb with her life at home. But I would force her to choose, and I would ensure she paid the price for her betrayal, just as Caleb would for his trespass. The villagers were already wary of Caleb after the fire. My whispers had spread further than I'd anticipated, painting him as an outsider with a dangerous streak. I decided to exploit their fears. I began planting seeds of doubt in earnest. In casual conversations at the market and tavern, I mentioned seeing Caleb lurking near the edge of the village, watching houses late at night. I hinted at his volatile temper, embellishing stories of imagined arguments and threats. "Did you hear about the miller's missing tools?" I said to one merchant. "I saw Caleb near his shed just the other night." Strange coincidence, isn't it? The rumors grew legs of their own, spiraling into wild accusations. By the end of the week, Caleb was no longer welcome in the tavern, and villagers avoided him on the streets. Elaine noticed the shift, though she didn't confront me about it. Instead, she seemed more withdrawn, her guilt weighing heavily on her. I could see it in the way her hands shook as she prepared meals, the way her voice cracked when she spoke to me. But she didn't leave. Not yet. I decided to escalate things further. Late one night, I returned to the remains of Caleb's cabin and scattered stolen tools and trinkets from the village around the site. I left a crude drawing of a wolf, a symbol often used to mark thieves in our region, etched into a piece of bark and pinned it to a tree. The next day, I reported my discovery to the constable, claiming I had stumbled upon the evidence during a walk. "It's Caleb," I said firmly. "He's been stealing from the village." The fire must have been his way of covering his tracks. The constable's brow furrowed. "You're sure about this?" "See for yourself," I replied, leading him to the scene. The so-called evidence was damning enough to solidify the villagers' suspicions. Caleb was summoned to answer for the thefts, his protests of innocence falling on deaf ears. Elaine's reaction was exactly as I'd hoped. She confronted me that evening, her face pale with anger. "You did this," she accused, her voice shaking. "I know you did." "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied coldly. "You've poisoned the entire village against him," she shouted. "Why? To punish me? To punish him?" "To protect what's mine," I said, my voice rising. "He's destroyed everything we built, Elaine, and you let him." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and fled the room, leaving me alone with my victory. Elaine barely spoke to me after that. She spent most of her days wandering the woods or sitting silently in the garden. I could see the anguish in her eyes, the weight of her choices finally catching up to her. But I wasn't finished. I knew Caleb would be desperate now, his reputation in ruins. I waited until nightfall, then slipped into the woods with a loaded musket. If he tried to leave the area, I would stop him. If he tried to approach Elaine, I would be waiting. For 2 nights, I watched his movements, lurking in the shadows near the river. On the 3rd night, he appeared, carrying a small sack of belongings. He looked haggard, his shoulders slumped as he trudged through the forest. "Going somewhere?" I called out, stepping into his path. He froze, his eyes narrowing when he saw me. "What do you want?" "To finish this," I said, raising the musket. Caleb's expression hardened. "You think this will fix things? Killing me won't bring her back to you." "I don't care," I replied. "You've already taken everything." Before he could react, I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, and Caleb fell to the ground, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, pooling on the earth. I stood over him, my hands trembling as I watched the life drain from his eyes. For a moment, I felt nothing but numbness. Then, the weight of what I'd done crashed down on me. I left him there, his body hidden among the undergrowth, and returned home in a daze. Elaine noticed the change in me immediately. She asked if I was unwell, but I brushed her off, retreating to my study to avoid her gaze. I couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. When news of Caleb's disappearance spread, the village assumed he had fled to escape punishment. No one mourned him, and life returned to its usual rhythm. But Elaine knew better. She began searching for him, venturing deeper into the woods each day. I watched her from the window, a hollow ache in my chest. She wouldn't find him. I had made sure of that. But her grief was a constant reminder of what I had lost. One evening, as Elaine returned from the forest, her face streaked with dirt and tears, she confronted me. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, avoiding her gaze. "You killed him," she accused, her voice rising. "I can feel it. I see it in your eyes." I didn't deny it. Instead, I turned away, my silence confirming her suspicions. Elaine crumpled to the floor, sobbing. "You've destroyed everything," she whispered. Elaine left the next morning, taking nothing but a small bag of belongings. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't ask. I watched her disappear down the road, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a stone. The house felt emptier without her. The village felt colder. I had won, but the victory was hollow. Months passed, and life moved on. The villagers forgot about Caleb, and Elaine's absence became just another story whispered in the tavern. But I couldn't forget. Every corner of the house reminded me of her, of the life we had shared before everything fell apart. I had wanted revenge, but all I had achieved was the destruction of everything I held dear. And now, I was alone, with nothing but the ashes of my choices to keep me company.